The keyword super refers to the superclass. It allows us to access the superclass variables, methods, and constructors. Here's a scenario where the superclass is inherited by the subclass. I like to say parent class and child class. The parent class does not have a defined constructor. Therefore, a default constructor is provided automatically by Java. You can watch my constructor video for more information on constructors. If we look at the child class, it also does not have a defined constructor. A constructor rule states a subclass constructor must invoke the superclass constructor, whether the superclass constructor is implicit or explicit. That means if there is a constructor in the parent class, then the child class must call that constructor in the parent class. In this scenario, both the parent class and child class have implicit constructors because they are not defined. Now, look what happens when I add a defined constructor to the parent class. I'm going to write public person, add a parameter for int ID. This dot ID equals ID. Look what happens when I save. There's an error in the child class. The error message states implicit superconstructor person with no parameters is undefined for default constructor. Must define an explicit constructor. That means the child class must have a defined constructor because the parent class has a defined constructor. In the child class, let's write public student, add some parameters for string, name, and int ID. Now we have a different compiler error. The error states implicit superconstructor person undefined must explicitly invoke another constructor. This is where the keyword super comes into play. We must invoke the superclass constructor using the super keyword. So we write super, control space, and we see a parameter for int ID. Select that option and the error goes away. If I write this dot name before super ID, we have a different error. Hover super ID and the message states constructor call must be the first statement in a constructor. Whenever we call a constructor, it must be the first statement. So we add super ID before this dot name equals name, and the error goes away. There are two ways to use the super keyword. This is one way where we call the superclass constructor. The second way is to access members of a superclass that has been hidden by the subclass. Now we see two methods, getter and setters. Getter ID for get ID getter method, set ID for setter method. In the subclass, hide the getter ID in the superclass and setter ID, set ID in the superclass. Let me show you how to access these superclass getter and setter methods. Go back to the child class and write public string display student information. Return personal ID. Get ID. Do you see student? This would call the subclass student method. We want the superclass person method. Therefore, we write super dot. And now we get ID for the superclass person method. We can also add a method from the subclass, child class. This example can have personal ID and it can have student ID. So I'm going to write student ID and call the ID from the child class student. There we go. A superclass variable operates just like a superclass method. However, the variable and method must be a public member. That's it for super keyword. You can follow me on Twitter, connect with me on LinkedIn, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. And the code will be on GitHub. And I'll see you in the next video.
Books available in paperback, ebook, and PDF. All Part 1 ebooks and PDF documents are free. Programming books for UFT. Programming books for Java. Here's the Selenium Automation book. And TestNG. Subscribe to get notification of future videos. Don't forget to like, comment, and share.